Hi everyone, welcome to Two Bald Guys Talking Safety. I'm Langdon DeMint.
And I'm Julian Taylor.
And welcome to our podcast.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Two Bald Guys Talking Safety. And for the more observant of you, you might have noticed that we're actually increasing the number of bald guys on this particular podcast. Eventually we will go for a world record and see how many bald guys we can get on one podcast talking safety. We're also joined by Joe Harmon, our CTO at Outage. So Joe, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself? Apart from being bald, what else do you do?
Well, thank you, Julian and Langdon. Thank you for deeming me worthy in my baldness to join this illustrious podcast. So yes, my name is Joe Harmon. I head up the product group here at Outage. Spent a good portion of my career in commercial products.
Great. Okay. And we've brought Joe along for a very specific reason today, because we've just recorded an episode of the pod where we talked about the importance of failure, understanding failure, and redefining what failure looks like within an organisation. And if I'm going to come over all American, I'd say, boy, have we got a failure for you today. We've got a pretty impressive failure. And the reason for bringing Joe along is it's a honker, as Langdon would say. So we brought Joe along because Joe posted on LinkedIn about this particular failure, I think towards the end of 2022. But we think there's some really sort of stark sort of links that we can make towards failure within safety. So Joe, do you want to kick us off and give us a bit of an outline as to what it is that we're actually talking about today?
Yes, thanks, Julian. So for those in North America, and you may have heard it in UK and Ireland and other regions as well, we had a particular airline that suffered a major outage the week before Christmas and then the week after Christmas, and that was Southwest Airlines. And it impacted tens of thousands of passengers, and I'll let Julian run down the exact impact to their customer base, but it was substantial. It was characterized as the largest airline industry meltdown in history. And as I was watching much of the debate about what was the cause for this outcome, it centered around, lack of ability of Southwest operational systems. And the more I read and the more I understood, it was this is a well-known issue. It was well known by the folks within the company. It was also well known by their C-suite. And I just felt that, the root cause of all this was a lack of responsible risk management by their C-suite. They knew the risk, they grossly underestimated the potential impact, and they basically rolled the dice and lost.
And just for those who don't know the scale of it, I think the scale was in excess of it was in excess of 15,000 flights were cancelled, weren't they? So you think about the sort of knock-on effect of that in terms of families, number of people, the length of time that they were sitting in airports, and it was an appalling situation. We've had our own sort of meltdowns in the UK. British Airways, pretty famously last year, had some issues around a new terminal, but this took things to a whole new scale, didn't it, Landon?
And I think, yeah, and it was a tough. We had some terrible weather. So you mix that with it was almost what, Joe? Wouldn't you say it was pretty North America covering of terrible weather? So I will preface, there was, you had, what was it, American, Delta, both of them had a couple thousand in the first couple of days. So we had a perfect storm, and then all of a sudden, one airline's had a more perfect storm that led to a lot more issues and the ramifications of some weather that then progressed. And I think that's, we were talking about failures on the last recording, and I did a presentation a few days ago and I mentioned failures, and I've talked to some peers about it. And, we talked about our definition of failures, which everyone will hear, and we'll get to that. But it's there's just so many aspects to me when you think about failures and what that really encompasses and what that means. And this is one of those that really progressed into a unfortunate territory, and it's going to be interesting to see, what happens moving forward.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you sort of compare this to safety. I think, Joe, you said in your intro that the leadership team at Southwest knew about this. They knew they'd got some weaknesses within the system, but they thought they could get away with it. And that's a classic analogy to safety management systems, isn't it? Where because we've not had an incident, we're doing okay.
Based on what I read, it sounded like they were very much aware of the situation. They chose not to allocate capital expenditures to address it at that particular time. And they had this false hope that they had mitigated some of the risk with some backup manual procedures. Obviously, they had never actually tested that backup manual procedures because it failed miserably. And, if you think about the actual impact to Southwest, there is obviously a revenue hit. They lost out on lots of direct, immediate revenue. Secondarily, they, took a terrible reputational hit in the market. But I think their real cost is going to be in years to come. And we discussed this. If you can imagine being, say, a family with young children, you're sitting at the gate, and right before you board, your plane gets canceled. Your bags have been checked, so you don't have your luggage. You don't have any other transportation options, and you're stranded. And so, how many months or years have to pass before that memory fades and stops influencing your future purchase decisions on who you choose to fly with? It's, we've all had kids, or maybe it was, the first time you got to go home for the holidays from a job as a young professional and you missed it completely. So I think long term, their cost is yet to be actually realized.
So again, as with safety, you've got that reputational element, haven't you? That actually will last for a long time. I think on average, I read a long time ago some statistics about how many people we tell when we've had a bad experience, and I think it's 11 or 12 people. So you imagine for every one of those 15,700 flights, for every passenger who's telling 11 or 12 people, and you can see this has become a global story, which, inherently is going to have a massive impact on Southwest.
I think it transitions, perfect example. So within a week of that, another large airline, American, sucked a guy in a jet engine and he died. And I've seen videos, I've used them before actually. There was a guy I remember years ago, Joe, I know you've seen it, the video we used to do in a training of a guy gets sucked through an engine and he lived. But, so there's a lot of factors and he died, and that's terrible. But as far as media, a lot of people haven't heard about that. The same thing was not made, and I'm not downplaying, I don't downplay Southwest, and I'm not trying to lift the other, but you're talking about a fatality. Somebody lost their life, and that was little to nothing to this mass, the focus, at least, was made to this mass issue. So I think that's a great point. What happens, what do we think about moving forward on a failure such as this, that we didn't lose a worker's life, at least not that I'm aware of or anything. I'm sure a lot of workers, employee morale was not at its highest, but you think about that transition, that's huge. And that shows the focus that a lot of times gets put on the ramifications of what a business does.
And its scale, isn't it? I think that's one of the interesting things if you talk about employee morale as well, because I think that contributed to the Southwest situation, didn't it? Because I think there was one particular airport, I think it was Denver Airport, they had actually a lot of their ground crew were absent from work that particular day. So you start to ask the questions as well, don't you? What's going on within an organisation that a lot of people are off sick at the same time? Because again, that's a morale issue, isn't it? And again, that could often relate back to safety, the mental health awareness piece, but again, it's the knock-on effect of poor safety, poor mental health could actually be one of the contributory factors to all of this.
A good lesson to be learned for health and safety from the Southwest incident was when they did the risk assessment, it appears, we don't know, but it appears they grossly underestimated the impact.
Yeah.
And probably the probability of occurrence as well. And I think in health and safety, a lot of times when we start doing risk assessments and we think about impact, there's a tendency to fall into this trap of thinking of personal injury.
Yeah.
Right. And to Langdon's point, in this case with Southwest, for what we know, there was no personal injury unless it was rage induced. But from angry customers. But, if you think about from an organization that has a health and safety group that's looking out for the welfare of their workers, part of that impact has to be the impact on the business itself. And in this case, the Southwest, it was apparently grossly underestimated.
No, and I read, and I'm sure you did also, talking about pilots, their accounts, how they knew that the issues were, whatever, and they've tried to, they weren't downplaying the work of the people because they all were working countless hours. And I read numerous accounts of pilots who were aware, employees who were aware, and they all just really jumped in to fix this massive failure. Because you're right, when you think about so this was for Southwest, on the job issue that affect people that were on the job and off the job during a very important time of year. And what does that do? And very applicable to workforce if a failure happens, if a process doesn't succeed the way we want, what does that do to our workforce? Whether it then creates more safety issues, whether that then drops down the overall risk from the off-the-job perspective. I mean, you start thinking it really can exacerbate quite a lot. And then you start bringing in what that does to employee morale, what that does to actually even wanting to be as cognizant of hazards, of general risk. I mean, it is deflating because, to your point, Joe, have a almost 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. I mean, for work, I'll probably still fly Southwest because I have done quite a lot with them historically. But there is a back of your head. What if you get somewhere and it's a mass issue again? And when we love going south to Disney, man, that's tough to say. I want to take the kids because I love my children very, very much. I don't want to sleep on the floor of the airport with them because I sometimes have to sleep in the bed with them. And that's not the most comfortable when they have rough nights. Not all the time, but when they have rough nights. So there's a lot of rundown effects that comes from this. And I think that's something we don't take into account.
But if you look at Southwest, their brand was known for loyal customers and an incredibly loyal workforce.
And smooth operation, honestly.
And smooth operation. And so getting back to just doing proper risk assessment and understanding the true impact if this risk were to actually become an incident, think about being a Southwest gate agent during this time. Do you think their loyalty to the organization has diminished somewhat? Their viewpoint on working for that organization has diminished. The next time a recruiter calls, do they actually take the call? And so when we're doing risk assessments within an organization, regardless of the application, I think the great takeaway, the great lesson is don't take lightly the analysis. So both the probability of occurrence, right? Because as you stated, weather precipitated this, but it didn't cause the meltdown. That was not the root cause. And so now you have mass risk, right? And the impact was grossly underestimated, apparently. And so for an organization to take the time to really think through, wow, if this scenario does play out, you know, and in the case of Southwest, how long does it take to recover?
Southwest is really good about giving freebies. How many freebies do you think they gave at the stand that day? At all their stands, I should say, those couple of days. Here, please have this for your child. Please have this. We don't have anything else to give. I'm sorry.
So let me ask you this, Langdon. If you had awakened at 5 a.m. after sleeping on the floor at the gate in the airport with your two young kids, how many points would they have given you so that you go, oh, well, thank you very much?
I better have been companion for the next 10 years, at
Exactly.
least.
And so therein lies their deficient impact assessment.
Joe, I think you made one of the biggest points for me there, which is, again, when you think about health and safety, you think about incidents, it's not just the immediate impact of something that we need to be so cognizant of. It's that ripple effect, isn't it, afterwards? And we've talked about this lots of times on the pod. And I think the other thing, Langdon, you're the guy who loves incident investigations. I mean, again, how do they investigate this? How do they actually investigate it so they properly get to that root cause of what happened here?
No, I think it's a good question because you think about sorry, you think about it from the larger perspective. And, I talk about, so a few years ago, I started doing JHA workshops, and the simplicity of it was just trying to think about including what you don't typically think about. And this was a scenario I'd read, what is it, relatively new, that their CEO, they've come in and they talk. He's not the one that had been there for the longest, so he's still relatively new. And everything I've read about him has been very positive, talking about trying to make changes because evidently Southwest maybe hasn't been on the cup of moving things forward the way they should have historically. So I think he's tried to make changes, but it does show sometimes we need to, and I don't know enough about the airline industry to be able to speak, on the backside of it from that perspective, very progressive. But it shows that how many times are we actually considering the risk that exist because of processes we have, and we're not making those changes as fast as we need to, because that's a big. And what do we even include in the risk? I'm going to assume they all knew about it, but they weren't really expecting, and Joe maybe allude to that or talk about that. They weren't expecting such a mass people wanting to change. So does that mean they didn't include that when they were thinking about inherent risk? Or, I don't know what that means, but that's a big issue.
So earlier on in the conversation, Langdon made the comparison between the Southwest incident and the very unfortunate American Airlines incident that involved a fatality, and how one got tons of press and the other didn't. And the difference being is, well, one incident affected tens and tens of thousands of people, all with multiple social media accounts. And so if you think about you're a company that has a fleet of company-owned vehicles that are on the road, and you're assessing the risk with that, what's the risk of one of them being in an accident that causes injury and then gets media attention? Or a construction company where there is a severe injury or fatality with a worker, and how that reflects again in the company's reputation. How does that affect future business? Do companies want to hire you? Do they want to run their own risk assessment about being associated with your brand now? And so I wonder, when they do their assessment of their incident investigation, if they go back and go, oh, when we were doing the impact analysis, did we even ask marketing at Southwest what the potential impact might be if this scenario played out? I don't know. I'm guessing not.
And it also shows the importance of actually reassessing processes, and even kind of messing around with, we've always looked at it this way, we've always done a process, whatever, XYZ, and are we taking everything into account? The whole point of people now looking and focusing on SIFs or serious injury fatalities, looking at catastrophic incidents, it's looking at the same old thing, but then how do we categorize it? And a lot of times we, I think, are bad about, Joe, you and I were talking about this a few minutes ago. We're bad about falling into our routine, whatever that is. It's funny, I've been talking to others and family. We talk about how we get so caught up in routine, and I'm notorious for it. But do we actually think about the perspective of if something different happened, because we're so used to, checking the boxes and not asking the other questions about processes or whatnot? That's a crucial element that's very telling about this. They completed it, but did they really consider adverse effects from it?
I think the routine piece is really important, Langdon, is that's part of what's happened here, isn't it? Southwest were in a routine. And the other really great analogy for safety is they'd got away with it before. And how often have we heard that in safety, where people get away with things so they think actually we're okay here. And you think about so much of what we've talked about over the last few months, actually that engagement piece about people telling us things, because Southwest might have been getting away with things and not even knowing about what was going on in the background, not knowing what's going on at Denver Airport. So actually you can't deal with the stuff you don't know about, can you? So there's so many sort of factors here that sort of are aligned to what we talk about within the safety world.
And it's interesting because I've seen this stat, Joe, you probably know it. Every year they put the most reliable airlines and this and that. And I don't like flying, so my focus is always just get me there safely. I used to do it a lot. But Southwest was the one that really and truly, their delays, it felt like, from my experience, were always less. I was rarely ever delayed. Things were on time. I was comfortable with it. People always, and then you throw a curveball like this that actually shows, was there more that they've been getting away with?
Well, that's a great takeaway, because if you look at Southwest, that was their brand, right? They depart and arrive on time. They have this great loyal staff that it's fun to fly, right? You see all the videos of on the planes of the announcements, how fun it is. And, that's damaged to some degree. To what degree, who knows? Only time will tell. But that's decades of building brand equity that, with a, unfortunate oversight, a good portion of that is lost. And it'll take time to build it back. And we can think of other companies or organizations that has faced this similar type of unfortunate public event, and it takes a long time to recover from those.
But sometimes, and that is a really good point, though, because sometimes we think about it and we kind of hit on the other, and I know we've all talked about it. A lot of companies, some of the quote unquote safest companies are the ones that have done the best. They've had failures of some type or another, and then they've become even greater for it. So it'll be the way Southwest is. I wouldn't be surprised if they turned it around, but it's still, they have a very strong loyalty base, myself being one included. But still, I think it's one of those, it'll be interesting because you learn there was a failure of a process. How do you come back from it better? And that is a good takeaway also to think about it. It's always wanting to improve. That's the whole focus of continuous improvement.
I think that's probably a really good place to wrap this one up, Langdon. I think you've summed it up perfectly. I was studying thinking, how can I sum this pod up? And you've just done a perfect job for me. So
thank you.
That's a really good place to wrap.
Hey everyone, really appreciate you tuning into this episode of Two Bald Guys Talking Safety. Please follow and subscribe to wherever you stream your favorite podcast, or visit us at evotix.com.
And if you want to see how follically challenged we really are, come and check us out on YouTube. If you've got value from the podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts, and in the review section of this podcast, If you could leave us a review or a rating, that would be great.
And as always, everyone, while you're going about your days and about your normal lives, stay safe out there and watch each other's back.